What if everything you've been taught about war is only half the story? We grow up learning that wars are fought for freedom, for power, or for justice. But what if behind those noble words lies something far colder, far more deliberate, and infinitely more profitable? What if the real battlefields weren't in the trenches or the skies, but in the ledgers of banks that never fired a shot, yet decided who would rise, who would fall, and who would pay the price? Every cannon fired, every plane built, every uniform sewn, all of it demands one thing first: money. And the moment nations run out of it, the real players step in. The ones who understand that war isn't just chaos, it's business. Massive, calculated business. Imagine secret meetings in candlelit rooms far from the sound of gunfire. Men in tailored suits discussing not strategy, but interest rates. While soldiers prepared to die, bankers prepared balance sheets. Because behind the front lines, hidden in the shadows of global finance, another kind of war was being fought. A quiet, invisible struggle for control over nations drowning in debt. This is the part of history that rarely makes the textbooks. The secret channels of gold shipments that kept empires alive. The private letters exchanged between financiers and kings. The loans that funded both sides of the same conflict, ensuring that no matter who won, one group always came out richer. Take the Napoleonic Wars, for instance. Europe burning, millions dead, and yet one family's banking network was quietly transferring gold across borders, financing armies, and reshaping Europe's financial system forever. Or consider the Second World War, when neutral Switzerland became the meeting ground for an international bank that kept operating even while nations were at war with each other. It's a story of power hidden in plain sight. The story of how money moves faster than any army, and how control over that money can shape the course of human history. And what's most unsettling is this: the same system that financed wars centuries ago never truly disappeared. It simply changed names, changed faces, and kept doing what it always did, turning conflict into profit. Because while generals plan invasions, bankers plan repayments. When nations crumble, banks rise. And when the world rebuilds, it's often with money borrowed from the same people who financed its destruction. So the question isn't just who started the wars, it's who paid for them. Who had the power to keep the fighting going long after the governments ran out of gold? And what secret institution still controls that power today? Because if history has one consistent truth, it's this: behind every war, behind every empire's rise and fall, there has always been a hidden hand writing the checks. And once you follow the money, the story of war begins to look very different. Every war begins with a spark, but what fuels that spark isn't ideology or courage or even hatred, it's money. Without it, armies don't march, ships don't sail, and factories don't produce. Every bullet fired, every tank built, every bomb dropped carries a price tag. And behind every one of those costs is someone paying the bill and someone collecting on it. It's easy to see wars as political or moral struggles, but that's only the surface. Underneath, they're economic events, massive financial operations that depend on constant funding to survive. And as strange as it sounds, war is one of the greatest engines of economic activity in human history. It drives production, innovation, and debt on a scale that no peaceful economy could ever sustain. Governments know this. They always have. The problem is that no nation, no matter how powerful, ever has enough cash to fund a full-scale war outright. Taxes can only go so far before citizens revolt. Printing more money causes inflation. So leaders turn to the same people who've been quietly profiting from conflict for centuries, the financiers. These are not politicians or soldiers. They're the ones sitting in the back rooms, calculating how much a war will cost and how much it could earn them in return. When the treasury runs dry, they offer lifelines in the form of loans and bonds. But those lifelines come with strings: interest rates, repayment schedules, national assets pledged as collateral. Wars may end, but those contracts don't. The earliest examples stretch back centuries. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Spain, waged endless wars for colonies and dominance. Behind every campaign, private banks extended credit to kings who couldn't pay in cash. Some historians even argue that the birth of modern banking itself, institutions like the Bank of England, wasn't about commerce at all. It was about war, about ensuring the crown could always borrow enough to fight the next battle. Once that model worked, it became the blueprint. Nations would issue government bonds, essentially IOUs, to raise quick money from wealthy investors. These bonds were traded, speculated on, and manipulated. If a nation won a war, its bonds went up in value. If it lost, the bonds crashed, wiping out fortunes. In other words, war became a market. Victory or defeat could be profitable depending on which side of the bet you were on. And that's when something quietly shifted. War stopped being just a matter of national pride. They became financial opportunities. When nations realized they could borrow endlessly, they also realized they could wage longer, larger wars than ever before. The cost no longer acted as a restraint, it became an investment. During World War I, the British government borrowed so heavily that even after victory, the country was essentially bankrupt. The United States stepped in with loans, many of them financed by private banks, that would tie Europe to American debt for decades. During World War II, the same pattern repeated on an even bigger scale. The bonds, the loans, the industrial production, it all fed into a single self-reinforcing machine where war wasn't just fought for survival, it was fought for solvency. And every time the guns fell silent, the cycle restarted. Rebuild, rearm, borrow again. The debt never truly vanished, it just evolved. Today, central banks and international financial institutions perform the same role, only with more sophisticated tools. Printing money, managing inflation, controlling interest rates, all mechanisms born from centuries of wartime finance. If you followed the money long enough, a pattern emerges. Wars start, economies boom, debts rise, and the same networks of power, banks, corporations, investors, end up in control of both the destruction and the reconstruction. It's a system so embedded that it no longer shocks anyone. Yet if you trace its origins, it all goes back to a time when one banking family discovered that lending to governments was far more profitable than lending to individuals. That discovery would change the world forever. It would make the family name synonymous with power, secrecy, and unimaginable wealth. And during one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, they would prove just how valuable it was to be the banker behind the throne. Because the Napoleonic Wars didn't just reshape Europe, they revealed the blueprint for how money could rule the battlefield. And the family at the center of it all? The Rothschilds. At the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was on fire. Napoleon Bonaparte's armies swept across the continent, dismantling empires, rewriting borders, and plunging nations into chaos. Governments fell, kings fled, and currencies collapsed. In a time when no country was safe, one family quietly built an empire that would outlast them all. Their name was Rothschild. While generals commanded armies, the Rothschilds commanded information, and that made them even more dangerous. The 5 Rothschild brothers were scattered across Europe, from London to Frankfurt, Vienna to Naples, forming a private intelligence and financial network faster and more reliable than any government system. Couriers, coded letters, and private agents carried news, gold, and instructions across war-torn borders, often days or weeks before official channels even knew what had happened. This network gave them an advantage no army could match: knowledge. In an era where battles could decide the fate of nations, knowing who had won before anyone else could mean the difference between ruin and fortune. And the Rothschilds used that power masterfully. When Britain needed to fund its war against Napoleon, it turned to Nathan Mayer Rothschild, the family's London representative. Britain's survival depended on paying its allies, armies in Spain, Prussia, and Austria, fighting Napoleon's forces. But the gold required for those payments couldn't be moved easily across borders during wartime. Nathan stepped in, using his network to smuggle and deliver millions in gold through enemy lines, ensuring the troops were paid, the alliances held, and Napoleon's enemies stayed in the fight. It wasn't charity, it was strategy. By becoming indispensable to Britain's war effort, the Rothschilds secured influence that extended far beyond finance. When Napoleon finally fell, the Rothschilds were in a position no one had ever been in before. They weren't just bankers, they were kingmakers. One of the most famous stories, though often dramatized, captures this perfectly. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Nathan Rothschild reportedly received news of Napoleon's defeat long before anyone else in London. According to legend, he used that early information to manipulate the London stock market, selling government bonds to create panic, then quietly buying them back at a fraction of their value when victory was announced. Whether fully true or exaggerated over time, the story reflects a deeper truth. The Rothschilds had turned information into wealth, and wealth into power. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschild family had become the most powerful financial dynasty in Europe. They financed governments, built railways, and underwrote industrial projects that transformed entire nations. But their true genius wasn't just in making money, it was in making themselves essential. Every major government owed them something. Every major power wanted their backing. And that influence would quietly shape European politics for the next 100 years. Yet their rise also sparked fear and suspicion. How could a single family, with no army and no flag, wield more control than most nations? Whispers began to spread that the Rothschilds could crash markets, topple kings, or fund wars on both sides if they wished. Some of those rumors were exaggerated, others unfounded. But one thing was undeniable. They had built the blueprint for how financial power could rule without ever taking the throne. And perhaps most telling of all, they understood something governments never fully did. Wars come and go, but debt endures. A battlefield victory might last a decade, a financial one could last centuries. What the Rothschilds mastered during the Napoleonic Wars would become the template for every major conflict that followed. They showed the world that the real power of war didn't lie in cannons or cavalry. It lay in credit, gold, and information. And as the 20th century approached, a new kind of financial empire would rise. One even more secretive and far more influential than any private family could ever be. Because the Rothschilds built the model, but the world's central banks perfected it. By the early 20th century, the world had changed, but the game had not. Wars had grown larger, faster, and more industrial. Nations could now destroy each other not just with armies, but with economies. Yet the question remained, who controlled that economy? Who had the power to decide which nation would rise from the ashes and which would never recover? Out of that question came one of the most powerful, secretive institutions the world has ever seen, the central bank. At first, central banks were born from necessity. After centuries of chaos caused by private financiers, governments wanted a single institution that could stabilize the nation's money, issue currency, and manage debt. But in practice, central banks didn't end the influence of private power. They centralized it. They became the perfect middlemen between governments desperate for cash and investors eager for profit. The formula was simple. The government borrowed, the central bank printed, and the people paid, through taxes, inflation, and decades of debt. But as global trade expanded and wars began involving not just empires but entire continents, even that wasn't enough. The financial system needed a nerve center, an institution that could coordinate all central banks, manage cross-border payments, and control money flows between nations. That's how, in 1930, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, was born. Officially, it was created to handle German reparations after World War I and to promote cooperation among central banks.
Unofficially, it became something far more powerful, secretive, and centralized. A private meeting ground for the world's financial elite, protected by international law, answerable to no government. Tucked away in Basel, Switzerland, the BIS operated in near total secrecy. Its members were the heads of the most powerful central banks on Earth: the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the Reichsbank, the Bank of France, and others. They met behind closed doors, discussed the flow of global capital, and made decisions that could shift economies overnight. During World War II, the BIS took on an even darker reputation. While nations battled in the fields of Europe, the BIS quietly facilitated transactions for both Allied and Axis powers. Gold looted by the Nazis from occupied countries found its way through BIS accounts. And while bombs fell on cities across Europe, financial cooperation continued inside the bank's fortified Swiss offices as if the war outside didn't exist. To many, it was the ultimate symbol of how money transcends morality. Governments may change sides, soldiers may die, but the financial system remains loyal only to profit. After the war, the BIS was nearly dissolved for its wartime dealings, but it survived. And it didn't just survive, it grew. Today, it still sits quietly in Basel, hidden in near plain sight, coordinating monetary policy between nations. It has no democratic oversight, no elections, no accountability to the public. Yet its decisions ripple through the global economy, from the interest rates that determine your mortgage to the inflation that dictates the price of bread. The BIS is often called the central bank of central banks, and for good reason. It doesn't print money, but it shapes how and when money moves. It doesn't own armies, but it influences the governments that do. Its power is not shouted from podiums, it's whispered in meetings between the world's most influential bankers, far away from cameras, beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. And this is where the story of the secret bank becomes more than just history. Because while the Rothschilds built an empire through family connections, the BIS built one through institutions. It turned financial influence into a global architecture, one that still operates today, hidden behind terms like monetary policy, economic coordination, and financial stability. But the real question is stability for whom? As the 20th century marched forward, new conflicts erupted. Wars fought not only on land and sea, but in boardrooms and trading floors. And again, just like before, the same invisible hand reached out to fund both destruction and recovery. Because by then, the system was complete. The financiers no longer needed to choose sides. They owned the game. And the next chapter of this story would prove just how far that power could go, when the banks that financed war became the same ones rebuilding the peace.
Whenever power moves in silence, rumors follow. And the world of war finance is no exception. For centuries, whispers have circulated about a secret bank, a hidden network that funds both sides of every major conflict, ensuring that, no matter the outcome, it always wins. It's an idea that feels like conspiracy, but like most legends, it's built on fragments of truth. From the Rothschilds of the 19th century to the BIS of the 20th, one pattern remains impossible to ignore. Whenever nations go to war, money flows through the same hands. Loans are made, interest accumulates, and economies are rebuilt, all within the same closed circuit of global finance. To the public, wars look like national struggles. But behind the curtain, the financiers who enable them often treat the battlefield as just another market. That's where the secret bank myth begins, not as a single institution with a name and address, but as a network, an invisible architecture that connects governments, central banks, and private financial powers in a web too complex for ordinary citizens to see. To many, it feels like coincidence that the same organizations that financed wars also financed the peace treaties, reconstruction loans, and post-war industries that emerged afterward. But history suggests it's not coincidence at all. It's design. Consider World War II. When the dust had settled, the nations of Europe were bankrupt, their cities reduced to rubble. And yet, almost immediately, Loans began to pour in to rebuild what had just been destroyed. Who provided them? The same financial institutions that had profited from wartime bonds and industrial financing. Even the United States Marshall Plan, hailed as a humanitarian effort, channeled billions into European reconstruction, much of it routed through banks that had grown rich during the war itself. The cycle was complete. Finance the destruction, then finance the recovery. For the public, it was framed as rebuilding the world. For the bankers, it was business as usual. Still, these systems rarely operate in total darkness. Every once in a while, cracks appear. Classified documents leak, investigative journalists dig too deep, or whistleblowers hint at how global money actually moves during conflict. We learn about the secret gold transfers of World War II, the covert funding of Cold War operations, and the shadowy mechanisms that allow sanctioned nations to keep trading through intermediaries. The story always looks the same. When there's profit to be made, the lines between friend and enemy blur. But the secret bank narrative isn't just about greed. It's about control. Money doesn't just fund wars. It dictates their length, their scope, and sometimes their very existence. A nation that runs out of money cannot fight, but a nation with endless credit can fight forever. And those who control that credit can decide when the fighting stops. Of course, the deeper you go, the harder it is to separate fact from speculation. Did one single hidden cabal truly engineer every war in modern history? No credible evidence proves that. Yet the undeniable truth remains. Throughout history, wars have always made the financial elite richer and the nations fighting poorer. The secrecy only adds to the myth. The closed-door meetings, the coded communications, the economic jargon that shields decisions from public understanding. All of it creates the perfect environment for suspicion. Because power that cannot be seen always feels like manipulation. And that's why the legend of the secret bank endures. It represents something more than a conspiracy theory. It's the symbol of an uncomfortable truth that money has no allegiance, and those who control it have learned how to profit from both order and chaos. Whether you believe in a single hidden bank or not, one thing is clear. The machinery of war is sustained not by ideology, but by liquidity. Every conflict, every crisis, every moment of collapse is an opportunity for someone who knows how to move money faster than nations can move troops. And as the 21st century unfolded, that machinery only became more efficient. Digital banking, instantaneous transactions, global trade networks. Today's wars are fought not just with weapons, but with algorithms and capital flows invisible to the public eye. The secret bank may no longer need vaults or gold shipments. Its new currency is data. Its new battlefield is global finance itself. And the greatest power it holds isn't in starting wars, but in deciding which ones are allowed to end. When the smoke clears and the treaties are signed, the world always talks about victory. But victory is only half the story. The other half lies in the balance sheets, in the quiet rooms where nations count their losses and calculate their debts. Because while war ends on the battlefield, it continues in the banks. The aftermath of every major conflict has followed the same pattern. Nations collapse under debt, currencies weaken, and reconstruction begins. But reconstruction isn't charity, it's business. Massive loans, infrastructure deals, foreign investments, all pouring in under the promise of rebuilding. And who provides the capital? The same financial powers that helped fund the destruction in the first place. It's a cycle that never truly stops. After World War I came the reparations crisis, which crippled Germany and set the stage for another war. After World War II came the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, but also locked it into an American financial system dominated by the dollar. After every major war, a new economic order emerges, and the same class of financiers sits at its center. That's the quiet genius of war finance. It turns chaos into opportunity. The greater the destruction, the greater the demand for loans, credit, and rebuilding. Nations think they're recovering, but in reality, they're entering the next phase of dependency. Debt replaces defeat as the new weapon of control. Fast forward to today,
The players have changed, but the script remains eerily familiar. The Bank for International Settlements still meets in Basel. Central banks still coordinate global policy. Nations still borrow astronomical sums for defense budgets that never shrink. And when new conflicts break out, whether in Europe, the Middle East, or anywhere else, the flow of capital responds instantly. Stock markets shift, defense contracts surge, and investment portfolios realign to profit from uncertainty. Only now, the wars don't even need bombs to begin. Economic sanctions, trade wars, currency manipulation, these are the battlegrounds of the modern age. The financiers of the past used gold and paper. Today's power brokers use data, algorithms, and digital currencies. And while ordinary citizens debate politics, the real decisions about who thrives and who collapses are made quietly by institutions that answer to no electorate, no flag, and no moral code beyond profit. It's easy to believe we've moved past the old world of secret banks and shadowy deals, but in reality, we've only made them invisible. The power is no longer concentrated in a family dynasty or a single vault. It's embedded in the very structure of the global economy. Every time a nation borrows, every time inflation rises, every time markets crash and recover, the same invisible network adjusts, profits, and tightens its grip. And here's the most chilling part. The system doesn't need wars to survive anymore. It creates its own forms of conflict: economic crises, inflationary bubbles, political instability, anything that keeps nations borrowing and people distracted. It doesn't matter who wins or loses as long as the game continues. This is the legacy of the war bankers, a world where power is measured not in armies, but in access, where conquest happens not with soldiers, but with spreadsheets, where history is still written by the victors, but financed by the same hands that funded every side. So, the next time you hear about a war breaking out, a market crashing, or a new alliance being formed, remember the story you're hearing is only half of it. The rest is unfolding quietly in digital ledgers and financial corridors most of us will never see. Because the truth is, wars may start with politics, but they end with profit. And as long as there's money to be made from conflict, the bankers of the world will never truly let peace have the final word.
Every empire believes it controls its destiny. Every nation believes it fights for honor, justice, or survival. But behind those flags and slogans lies a quieter truth, that no war, no revolution, no rebuilding effort ever happens without someone calculating the profit. When we look back at the last 2 centuries, the pattern is unmistakable. Nations rise and fall, leaders come and go, borders shift and redraw, but the system that funds it all remains untouched. The money moves, invisibly, through time and blood. And every new crisis simply feeds the machine that was built generations ago. That's the hidden cost of control. Stability built on dependence, freedom traded for credit, peace maintained not through diplomacy, but through debt. The same financial logic that built the empires of the past now governs the global order we live under today. An order where a handful of institutions can influence the fate of billions without ever firing a shot. Most people never question it. We're told that banks are neutral, that markets are natural, that money simply follows supply and demand. But history tells a different story. It tells us that money doesn't just follow power, it creates it. That wars aren't just fought over resources, they're financed to reshape them. And that the true victors are rarely the ones celebrated in history books, but those who ensure the debts keep rolling in long after the war is won. Today, that system has evolved beyond the reach of any single government. Algorithms decide in seconds what used to take weeks. Global debt has climbed into the hundreds of trillions,
and most of it is owed to entities that exist beyond national borders. The world's financial order has become its own kind of empire, one without armies, without territory, but with influence so vast that even superpowers must obey its rules. And yet, the most unsettling part is how normal it all feels. We scroll through headlines about wars, recessions, and economic adjustments, never realizing they're often symptoms of the same underlying force. Because control doesn't always come from violence. Sometimes it comes from the quiet pressure of numbers, from interest rates, sanctions, and loans that shape the decisions of entire governments. So when people talk about the secret bank that financed every war, they're not just talking about one institution or one family. They're talking about an idea that money, when concentrated in the right hands, can do more than buy power. It can become power. And that power has no flag, no ideology, and no limit. The world we live in today, the currencies we use, the debts we inherit, the crises we endure, all trace back to the same invisible architecture. The system built in the smoke of past wars still funds the conflicts of the present. And unless we start asking who benefits each time the world burns, it will continue funding the ones yet to come. Because at the end of every war, there's always a winner. And more often than not, it's not the nation that fought the hardest, but the one that financed both sides.